I found something that morning that I was never supposed to find. A staircase hidden beneath a church floor, steps carved from stone, leading straight down into darkness, and at the bottom, rows of iron-barred cells that existed on no map, no blueprint, no record anywhere in the world. Someone had not just hidden those cells. Someone had erased them. And when I finally understood why, I realized the greatest prison I had ever seen was never built to hold dangerous people. It was built to bury a truth that powerful men decided the world could never know. Stay with me until the end of this story, because by the time I finish, you will understand that what I found beneath that church floor was not just a hidden room. It was an entire generation of stolen lives, and the people who stole them almost got away with it forever. To understand why I stepped into that abandoned church on an ordinary morning, you need to understand who I was before any of this began. My name is Sister Maren. I have lived inside the walls of the convent of St. Editha for over 20 years. My life there was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet, still on the surface but full of movement underneath. My work was not prayer alone. My responsibility was the preservation of old church records, forgotten correspondence, crumbling maps, and historical documents that most people considered worthless. I believed that forgotten history was simply history that had not yet found someone patient enough to listen to it. I believed every unanswered question eventually had a logical explanation if you were willing to sit with it long enough. I never imagined that belief would one day lead me into a place that looked like something God Himself had forgotten. The church in question sat at the edge of the old Veldthorn Valley, roughly 40 miles from the convent, St. Calla's Church, abandoned for decades. The regional diocese had commissioned a restoration survey before deciding whether the structure was worth preserving or simply too far gone. Someone suggested I accompany the team because of my experience reading old architectural records. I agreed without hesitation. I thought I was going to spend 2 weeks cataloging dusty papers and taking measurements. I thought I would be home before the first snow of autumn. The moment I saw St. Calla's, something inside me shifted. The bell tower had collapsed inward decades ago. The stained glass was almost entirely gone, just jagged edges of colored glass still clinging to the lead frames like broken teeth. The cemetery out front was so overgrown that the headstones were barely visible beneath the weeds. The outer walls were crumbling but still thick, incredibly thick for a church of that period. I remember noting that in my journal that first afternoon, the walls are too thick, far thicker than any structural necessity would require. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I was wrong to think nothing of it. Inside, the air smelled like cold stone and something older than dirt. Mold, yes, but also something underneath the mold. A stillness that felt almost pressurized, like the air itself had been sealed in there for a very long time and was only now exhaling for the first time. The nave floor was made of large limestone slabs, uneven from age and soil movement. On my third day inside, I was moving carefully along the northern aisle when I felt it. One of the floor slabs gave slightly beneath my right foot, not a crumble, not a crack. A deliberate, almost mechanical give, like something below had shifted. I knelt down immediately. I pressed both palms flat against the stone. It was not settling. The slab was sitting above a hollow space. I told myself it was likely a drainage channel, maybe an old foundation void, common in churches of this age. I called over one of the restoration workers, a man named Cal, who had been hired locally. He helped me carefully lift the edge of the slab using flat pry bars. What we found beneath it was not a drain. It was a stone staircase, deliberately cut, deliberately finished, descending into absolute darkness. Cal looked at me. I looked at him. He said he was not going down there. I understood. But I also knew that I was going down there whether he came or not. I had a flashlight. I had my journal. I descended alone. The stairs went down further than any storage room needed to go, at least 20 feet below the church floor. When I reached the bottom and swept my flashlight across the space ahead of me, I stopped breathing for a full 3 seconds, because what I saw was not a cellar, it was a corridor, and on both sides of that corridor, stretching back into the dark, were iron-barred cells. 8 of them. 4 on each side, each one roughly 6 feet wide, each one with a rusted iron door fitted with a locking bar. And inside every cell, the stone walls were covered in scratches, not random scratches, names, dates, words in an old regional dialect that I recognized from the documents I had studied for years back at the convent. My hand was shaking when I opened my journal. I started writing everything down, every name I could read, every date. The earliest one I found that first day was from the year 1698. The most recent I found scratched anywhere in that entire underground space was 1741, 43 years of people being held in that place. People who, as far as the world above them knew, had simply disappeared. I spent the next 4 days mapping every inch of those cells before I told anyone else what I had found. I was not hiding it. I was protecting it, because already, on that first evening when I returned upstairs and mentioned to the project lead that I had found something significant below, he looked at me in a way that made my stomach tighten. He told me I was probably looking at old storage vaults. He told me not to disturb the structural foundation. He told me to focus on the archival materials. I nodded. And I went back down the following morning before he arrived. What I found in the second week changed everything I thought I understood about that place. Tucked behind a loose stone in the furthest cell, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow held against the moisture, was a bound journal. The ink was faded but legible. It had been written by a man named Aldrich Massa, who identified himself as the keeper of what he called the Veldthorn Vault. And what Aldrich Mosse wrote in that journal, in careful, almost remorseless handwriting, was a detailed record of every person imprisoned in those cells and the reason they had been placed there. Not criminal charges, not court orders. The reasons listed were things like disputed inheritance, refusal to vacate family land, possession of contested legal documents, and in 3 heartbreaking cases, simply being the surviving heir to a property that a powerful local family called the Draven family wanted to absorb into their own estate. The Dravens. The name appeared on nearly every page. Not as criminals in the journal, as clients. As the people who paid Aldrich Moss and his private associates to make certain people quietly disappear so that land claims, inheritance rights, and legal disputes would simply resolve themselves once the person pressing the claim was no longer present to press it. When I finally sat down that evening in my makeshift workroom in the church vestry and truly absorbed what I had read, I cried. Not softly. I wept in the way you weep when you realize that a grief you are feeling is not your own, but belongs to dozens of people who never had anyone weep for them. These were not criminals. They were farmers and tradespeople and young widows and elderly landowners. They were people whose only crime was owning something that someone more powerful wanted, and they had been lowered into that underground place and left there until they were no longer a problem. Over the following weeks, I widened my search. I contacted a regional archivist named Dr. Lena Foss who specialized in land records from that period. I was careful about what I said over the phone. Careful because by then I had found 2 things that made me genuinely uneasy. First, a page of the Mossy Journal had been torn out. Recently torn, based on the freshness of the paper edge compared to the aged brittleness of the surrounding pages. Second, I had received an unsigned letter slipped beneath the vestry door that simply read, "Some histories are better left as silence." I kept working. Dr. Foss was the one who broke the case open from the historical side. She found, in a regional land registry archive, documentation showing that between 1698 and 1743, 41 separate land parcels in the Veldthorn Valley had transferred ownership to the Draven family estate following the unexplained disappearance of the previous owners. 41 families. And when she cross-referenced those disappearances against the names I had transcribed from the cell walls, we matched 37 of them. 37 people whose families had spent decades not knowing, whose descendants had grown up with a family story that began with someone who one day simply did not come home. The climax of what I discovered did not come from a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, the way the most devastating truths always do. Dr. Foss located a surviving descendant of one of the imprisoned women, a schoolteacher named Vera, whose great-great-great-grandmother, a woman named Sella Cord, had been imprisoned in cell number 3 in the year 1709. Sella had been widowed and was the sole legal heir to 12 acres of farmland. She disappeared 6 weeks after her husband's funeral. Her children were told she had abandoned them. That story had lived in that family for 300 years. Vera sat across from me in a small coffee shop, and when I showed her Sella's name scratched into a photograph of that cell wall, she pressed her hand over her mouth and could not speak for a very long time. In the end, the church was not demolished. The Regional Historical Authority designated St. Calla's Church and its underground prison as a protected memorial site. The cells were preserved exactly as found. A memorial wall was installed at the entrance listing all 37 identified names. 11 remained unidentified. I still think about those 11 every single day. The Draven family line had ended generations ago. There was no one left to hold legally accountable. But the truth was now documented, preserved, and public. The families who had carried unexplained absences in their histories for centuries finally had answers. Heartbreaking answers, but real ones. And I have come to believe that a heartbreaking truth is infinitely more merciful than a comfortable mystery that never resolves. I returned to the convent changed in ways I am still discovering. My faith did not weaken, it deepened. Because I believe now more than ever that bearing witness to suffering, even centuries after it occurred, is a sacred act. That remembering people who were deliberately forgotten is one of the most profound things a living person can do for the dead. Walls can imprison a body, but silence is what imprisons history, and someone must always be willing to break that silence, even when powerful voices are telling them to stop. Tell me in the comments below, if you had been the one to find that first iron-barred cell at the bottom of those stairs, would you have kept going or turned back? I genuinely want to know. And if this story changed what you expected to find beneath that abandoned church, please share it. Because Sella Cord and every name on that wall deserves to be remembered by more than just one quiet nun with a flashlight and a journal.